I mortgaged my house, the house my husband and I built with our own 2 hands, to give my son his dream. His thank you was to ban me from his grand opening, afraid my old-fashioned ways would embarrass him. When I showed up anyway, he had security shove me toward the service alley like I was the trash. But he forgot one thing. The woman who taught him how to hold a knife also taught herself how to read a health code. And I was about to give him one final lesson in standards, one that would shut his dream down before the first dessert ever left the kitchen. Before I begin, thank you for being here. For being part of this community. If you believe in the power of a woman knowing her own worth and demanding its value, you are in the right place. Please, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It means the world to me. Now let me tell you what they did to me. My name is Augustine Vance, and for 40 years, my life in the city of New Orleans was measured by the steady rhythm of a sharp knife on a cutting board and the constant gentle simmer of a well-tended roux. At 70 years old, I was the proud, now-retired owner of Augustine's Kitchen, a small 10-table diner nestled in the heart of the Treme neighborhood. It wasn't fancy. The floors were checkered linoleum, worn smooth by a million footsteps. The chairs were mismatched, collected over the years. But it was mine, and it was immaculate. My late husband, Joseph, and I opened it with nothing but a dream and a collection of his mother's recipes. He was the heart of the place, with a laugh that could fill the room and a welcome for every soul who walked through our door. I was the hands and the spine. I was the one who arrived before the sun, who scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, who made sure every ingredient was fresh and every dish was perfect. Joseph passed 10 years ago, but his spirit remained in the warmth of the place. My ministry was continuing what we had built together. We were known for our gumbo, a dark, smoky brew that took 2 days to make properly. But my real source of pride wasn't on the menu. It was framed on the wall, right next to the door for everyone to see. Our Grade A health inspection certificate from the city of New Orleans. For 40 consecutive years, Augustine's Kitchen never received anything less than a perfect score. Not once. To me, that A was more prestigious than any Michelin star. It was a promise to my community. It meant the food I served was not just delicious, but safe. It meant I respected the people who trusted me with their health and their hard-earned money. It was a testament to a life of doing things the right way with no shortcuts. Integrity was my main ingredient. That integrity was the foundation for everything, especially for my son, Damian. My only child. He was a brilliant boy, with a palate as sharp as a tack and a passion for the kitchen that I nurtured from the time he was old enough to stand on a stool and stir a pot. He had my hands, but he had his own dreams, dreams that were bigger and shinier than my little Treme diner. He went off to the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and the pride I felt was a physical thing, a warmth that spread through my chest. He was going to be the Vance who made a name for himself outside our neighborhood. When he came back to New Orleans after graduation, he was different. He was full of ideas about molecular gastronomy, deconstructed classics and foams and gels. He spoke of flavor profiles and mouthfeel, and turned his nose up at the traditional Creole cooking he was raised on. He was talented, no doubt about it. But he was also ashamed. Ashamed of our simple diner, of our working-class neighborhood, of the mother whose gnarled, work-worn hands had paid for his fancy education. His dream was to open his own restaurant, Aura. It would be in the trendy warehouse district, a world away from the Treme. It would be sleek and minimalist, with a menu full of tiny, expensive dishes that looked more like science experiments than food. He needed investors, a lot of them. He had the talent, but he didn't have the capital. That's where I came in. I had just sold Augustine's Kitchen to a nice young couple who promised to keep the name and the gumbo. The sale gave me a comfortable nest egg, enough to live on for the rest of my days. But my son had a dream. And for my entire life, my purpose had been to build a foundation for him. So I did what a mother does. I took the money from the sale of my life's work and then I went to the bank. I sat in a cold, sterile office and signed a stack of papers, taking out a second mortgage on the small, paid-for house on St. Philip Street that Joseph and I had bought when Damian was just a boy. The total was a number so large it barely seemed real. It was everything I had and then some. It was the culmination of 40 years of 16-hour days, of aching feet and a bad back. It was my past, my present, and my security for the future, all rolled into one cashier's check. When I gave it to him, his eyes lit up, but not with the gratitude I expected. It was the feverish, hungry gleam of pure ambition. "This is it, Mama," he said, his voice trembling. This is what gets us the Michelin star. This will finally put the Vance name on the map. He didn't see the sacrifice. He didn't see the 40 years of labor or the risk I was taking with my home. He only saw the fuel for his own rocket ship. I had handed him the keys to his future, not knowing he was already planning to lock me out of it. The 2 months leading up to the grand opening of Aura were a whirlwind of construction dust, designer consultations and press releases. I watched from a distance, my heart a confusing mix of pride and unease. Damian was in his element, directing contractors, tasting wines with sommeliers, and giving interviews to food bloggers about his vision. He was building his temple, and I, the woman who had laid the foundation stone, was not invited to the planning meetings. Every time I offered to help, to lend my 40 years of experience, I was gently but firmly rebuffed. "Mama, we have a design team for that," he'd say when I questioned the layout of the kitchen, which seemed to prioritize style over workflow. "Mama, the chef de cuisine handles all the sourcing," he'd say when I offered to connect him with the shrimper who had supplied my restaurant with the freshest Gulf shrimp for 30 years. I was being politely, systematically erased from my own investment. The phone call that cracked the foundation of my world came on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week before the grand opening. I was in my kitchen humming to the jazz station on the radio, my hands instinctively rolling out dough for a batch of kala, a simple pleasure. When the phone rang and I saw Damian's name, I smiled, expecting a last-minute request for advice or a simple call to share his excitement. "Mama," he said, his voice tight and unnaturally formal. "Everything is set for next week. The investors are flying in. We have the food critic from the Times-Picayune confirmed. It's going to be a huge night." "Oh baby, I know it will be," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "I've already got my dress laid out. The blue one you always liked." There was a pause. A heavy, dead silence on the other end of the line. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. "Listen, Mama," he began, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "About that. We need to talk." The dough in my hands felt suddenly cold. "This is a very specific kind of event," he continued, the words sounding rehearsed. "It's about a certain vibe, a certain image. Our investors are high-net-worth individuals from New York and Chicago. They're used to a certain level of sophistication. The critics, the influencers, it's all about the brand. Brand." The words were cold and foreign, a language I didn't speak. "What are you trying to say, Damian?" I asked, my voice quiet. He took a deep breath. "I'm saying, maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the grand opening." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering and cruel. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. "Not come?" I whispered. "Damian, I don't understand. I funded this restaurant. Your name is on the door, but my house is on the line." "I know, Mama, I know, and I am so grateful," he said quickly, the gratitude sounding hollow and automatic. "But you have to understand. You're from a different world. You're very traditional. The way you talk, the way you dress. It's just not the image we're trying to project. I can't have you there telling stories about my childhood in the Treme to a hedge fund manager. I can't have you trying to hug the food critic. You would embarrass me. Embarrass him." The words landed like a slap. Me, Augustine Vance. A woman who had carried herself with dignity and grace for 70 years, who had been a respected business owner and a pillar of her community. I would embarrass him. My love, my support, my very existence was a source of shame for him. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sharp. "So that's it? The mother who gave you everything isn't good enough to set foot in your fancy new restaurant?" "It's not about being good enough," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "It's about business. It's about perception. This one night has to be perfect. We can do a special family dinner for you later. A quiet one. A quiet one. A separate one. A dinner for the embarrassing mother who wasn't fit for public viewing." He was hiding me. He was ashamed of the very roots that had given him life. I don't remember what I said next. I think I just whispered, "I see," and hung up the phone. I stood in my kitchen, the scent of sweet dough filling the air, and felt a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. The woman who had mortgaged her home for his dream had just been told she was a liability to it. For 2 days I sat with that pain. It was a deep, hollow ache in my chest. But underneath the pain, a stubborn maternal love refused to die. "He's just nervous," I told myself. He's under a lot of pressure. The need to see it, the restaurant that my sacrifice had built, was a physical pull. I had to see it. I wouldn't make a scene. I would just go stand in the back for a few minutes and see my son's dream come to life. I would be invisible. A ghost of a mother, haunting the edges of his new life. I laid out my blue dress. And on the night of the grand opening, I wrapped my late husband's favorite chef's knife, its wooden handle worn smooth with a lifetime of use, in a piece of black velvet. It was to be my gift to my son. A reminder of where he came from. A symbol of a different kind of integrity. I was a fool. I thought a mother's love could still find a way in through a locked door. I had no idea he had already hired a guard to keep me out. The warehouse district at night was a different city. The old brick buildings, once filled with the scent of coffee and cotton, now housed art galleries and sleek, minimalist restaurants like Aura. The air here didn't smell of jasmine and Creole spices. It smelled of money and perfume. I paid the valet, my sensible 10-year-old Buick looking out of place among the Teslas and Porsches, and walked toward the entrance of my son's dream. Aura was less a restaurant and more a block of ice. It was all glass and steel and cold, gray stone. A single artfully twisted olive tree stood in a pot by the door, its leaves looking as out of place as I felt. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see a sea of people in black dresses and dark suits, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones and the tiny dramatic spotlights aimed at each table. It was a world away from the warm, welcoming chaos of Augustine's kitchen. I took a deep breath, clutching the velvet-wrapped knife to my chest, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The blast of cold air and the low thrum of electronic music was a physical shock. A hostess, a young woman with a severe haircut and a black dress that looked painted on, stood at a podium, her eyes scanning a tablet. She looked up at me, her gaze sweeping over my simple blue dress and sensible shoes with a flicker of disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she very much doubted it. "I'm here for the grand opening," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm Augustine Vance, Damian's mother." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her professional mask snapped back into place. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Let me just get the manager." She spoke into a tiny earpiece, and a moment later I saw him. My son, Damian. He was standing across the room talking to a group of men in expensive suits, a champagne flute in his hand. He looked like a king in his castle. He caught the hostess's eye, and she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in my direction. I saw the look on his face. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't joy. It was pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted around the room as if checking to see who had witnessed my arrival. His smile tightened. He didn't move toward me. Instead, he made eye contact with a mountain of a man in a black suit standing near the door, a security guard with an earpiece of his own. Damian gave a sharp, subtle jerk of his head in my direction. It was a signal. A command. Get rid of her. My blood ran cold. He wasn't going to come over. He was sending his hired muscle to deal with his own mother. The security guard moved toward me, his steps silent and purposeful. He was a large man, built like a refrigerator, and his face was a blank wall of indifference. He stopped in front of me, blocking my view of the restaurant, of my son. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm Damian Vance's mother. I'm a guest." A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or just annoyance, crossed his face. "My instructions are clear, ma'am. The owner has requested that you be escorted from the premises." Escorted from the premises. The words were so clinical, so brutal. I was being thrown out of the restaurant that my home, my life's work, had paid for. But why? I whispered, the velvet-wrapped knife feeling heavy and useless in my hands. "That's between you and him," the guard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "Now we can do this quietly, or we can make a scene. Your choice." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and silent. I looked past his broad shoulder and saw my son, my Damian, turn his back to me, laughing at something one of the investors had said. He was pretending I wasn't there. He was pretending this wasn't happening. The guard put a heavy hand on my arm. It wasn't violent, but it was firm. Unyielding. He began to steer me back toward the glass door, away from the light and the music, back into the night. My body was numb with shock and a grief so profound it felt like a death. When we were back on the sidewalk under the cold glow of the streetlights, I thought it was over. But it wasn't. The final humiliation was yet to come. "Look," the guard said, his voice rough with a feigned attempt at sympathy. "If your staff were making a delivery, you gotta go around back. Kitchen entrance is down that alley." He pointed a thick finger toward a dark, narrow alley between Aura and the next building. I could see the glint of overflowing dumpsters and hear the loud, rhythmic clang of the industrial dishwasher. He thought I was a worker. A delivery person. Someone who belonged in the back with the garbage and the noise. My own son had created an image of me so low that his security assumed I was the help. He released my arm and turned to go back inside, his duty done. I stood there on the cold pavement, the sounds of the party, the music, the laughter, mocking me through the thick glass. I was an outcast, a beggar at the feast I had paid for. The beautiful, velvet-wrapped knife in my hands suddenly felt like a weapon I had brought to my own execution. The dream of Aura was a nightmare. And I, the foundation, had just been told I belonged in the alley with the trash. I stumbled away from the gleaming, indifferent facade of Aura, my feet carrying me toward the dark maw of the service alley. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me needed to see the back of the house, the engine room of the place I had funded, to understand the machine that had just chewed me up and spit me out. The alley was narrow and smelled of grease and stale champagne. Two massive, overflowing dumpsters stood against the brick wall, their lids propped open, a feast for the flies. The loud, rhythmic ca-chunk of the industrial dishwasher echoed off the walls, a brutalist heartbeat for my son's sophisticated dream. I leaned against the cold brick, the rough texture a grounding reality against the slick, artificial world I had just been ejected from. The grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The velvet-wrapped knife, my husband's legacy, felt like a fool's offering. I had brought a piece of my heart to a place that had none. Just as I was about to turn and disappear into the night, the kitchen door swung open with a violent whoosh, spilling a rectangle of harsh fluorescent light and a cacophony of shouts and clanging pans into the alley. A young man in a stained white chef's coat backed out of the door, dragging a heavy, leaking trash bag. He didn't see me at first. He grunted as he heaved the bag toward the dumpster, and then he turned, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. His eyes met mine, and in that instant the world stopped. I knew him. His name was Isaac. He was a neighborhood boy, had grown up just a few blocks from my diner. I had watched him grow from a skinny kid who loved my beignet into a quiet, serious young man who wanted to be a chef. He had even worked for me one summer, washing dishes, his hands always moving with a careful, respectful efficiency. He was a good boy. He understood what it meant to do things the right way. His face, when he saw me standing there in my Sunday best, in the filth of the alley, was a canvas of pure, unadulterated horror. His mouth fell open. His eyes darted from my tear-streaked face to the grand entrance of Aura and back again. He didn't have to say a word. I saw it all in his expression. Shock, confusion, dawning comprehension, and then a deep, profound shame. Not his shame. Shame for his boss. Shame for what had been done to me, Augustine Vance, a woman he respected, a legend in the world he came from. His silent, horrified recognition was the spark. It was the act of being seen. In a place where I had been rendered invisible, this boy, this stranger who was not a stranger, saw me. He saw my history, my worth, my humiliation. And that spark, that simple human act of validation, ignited the kindling of my grief and turned it into a roaring, righteous inferno. The pain didn't vanish. It transformed. It cooled, it hardened, it sharpened into a single diamond-hard point of focus. The heartbroken mother retreated, and the professional, the proprietor of Augustine's kitchen for 40 years, took her place. And that professional saw everything. My gaze shifted from Isaac's horrified face to the chaotic kitchen visible through the open door behind him. And in a single sweeping glance, my expert eye, trained by a lifetime of obsessive cleanliness and impeccable standards, conducted a full, unofficial health inspection. It took less than 5 seconds. I saw raw chicken stored on a shelf above ready-to-eat produce, a cardinal sin of cross-contamination. I saw a cook with a beard but no beard net, his hands moving from a bowl of salad greens to a tray of raw fish without washing. I saw wiping cloths, meant to be kept in sanitizing solution, lying in a dirty heap on a prep surface. I saw food held in the temperature danger zone, sitting on the counter under the heat lamps for far too long. I saw a dozen critical violations, a symphony of sloppiness and disrespect for the basic tenets of food safety. They were cutting corners. In their rush to create beautiful, expensive plates for the wealthy investors out front, they were ignoring the fundamental, non-negotiable rules of the kitchen. My son, the man who was too embarrassed to have me in his dining room, was running a kitchen that would have given me a heart attack. He was serving shame-based perfection on the outside and courting a salmonella outbreak on the inside. The plan formed in my mind, not born of messy emotion, but delivered fully formed from the part of my brain that had my 40 years of health inspection reports memorized. It was a plan of beautiful, poetic, and professional justice. My unique encyclopedic knowledge of the Louisiana Sanitary Code, the very foundation of my own success, would become the weapon of his destruction. I straightened up, pulling my shoulders back. I was no longer a weeping old woman in an alley. I was an inspector. I was an enforcer. I was the living embodiment of the standards he had abandoned. I looked at Isaac, whose face was still a mask of shocked pity. I gave him a small, sharp nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was a nod of dismissal. He was part of a system that was rotten to the core, and I was about to condemn the whole building. I turned my back on the alley, on the noise, on the filth, on the ghost of my son's dream. I walked away from the restaurant, my steps no longer the stumble of a victim, but the measured, purposeful stride of a woman with a job to do. I had the evidence. I had the knowledge. I had the motive. He had shoved me out the back door, but he had forgotten one thing. The back door is where you see the truth. And the truth was about to shut him down. I walked the 2 blocks from the glittering, soulless facade of Aura back to the valet stand, my mind a machine of cold, clear logic. The shock and grief had been burned away, leaving behind the clean, hard steel of resolve. I was no longer a mother mourning a son. I was a professional preparing to file a grievance. When the young man brought my old Buick around, he looked at me with pity. He had seen me go in, proud and hopeful. He had seen the security guard steer me out, broken and weeping. I met his gaze, and my expression was so calm, so devoid of the emotion he expected, that he looked away, unsettled. I handed him a $10 tip, my hand perfectly steady. I did not drive home. I drove 2 blocks, pulled over to the curb under the orange glow of a streetlight, and parked. The sounds of the city, a distant siren, the rumble of the streetcar, the faint strains of a brass band from a bar down the street, were a comforting reality. This was my city. A city with standards. A city with a soul. A city whose rules my son thought he was too good for. I reached into my handbag and pulled out my smartphone. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, moved with a newfound purpose across the screen. I did not search for lawyers. I did not search for articles on ungrateful children. I opened the web browser and typed in a simple phrase, New Orleans Health Department anonymous tip line. The number was displayed in bold blue letters. I took a deep breath, the air in my car still and silent, and I dialed. A tired, professional voice answered on the second ring. City of New Orleans Public Health Division. How can I help you? Good evening, I began, my voice a perfect imitation of the dozens of concerned citizens I had heard call into radio shows over the years. It was calm, level, and infused with civic duty. I would like to report a series of potential public health hazards at a new restaurant in the Warehouse District. Okay, ma'am. Can I get the name and address of the establishment? The restaurant is called Aura, I said, spelling the name out for her. It's on Julia Street. Tonight is their grand opening. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard on the other end of the line. Aura. Yes, I have them here. They passed their initial inspection last week. What is the nature of your concern? This was the moment. This was where my 40 years of expertise became a weapon. I did not rage. I did not accuse. I simply reported with the cold, factual precision of a seasoned inspector. I was in the vicinity of the rear service entrance approximately 30 minutes ago, I stated, choosing my words with care. The kitchen door was propped open. From my vantage point in the public alleyway, I observed several potential violations of the state sanitary code. I observed what appeared to be raw poultry being stored on a wire rack directly above uncovered, ready-to-eat salad greens. That would be a potential violation of Section 2315, regarding the prevention of cross-contamination. The clicking on the keyboard stopped. There was a new note of attention in the operator's voice. I was no longer just a crank caller. I was speaking her language. I also observed multiple food service employees with facial hair who were not wearing the required beard restraints, a potential violation of Section 1904. One employee was seen handling raw fish and then moving to a different station to handle vegetables without changing gloves or washing his hands. Furthermore, there were multiple wiping cloths on preparation surfaces, not stored in a sanitizing solution as required by Section 29 to 11. And finally, I observed several trays of what appeared to be hot-held appetizers sitting on a counter, far from any heating element, for an extended period of time, placing them squarely in the temperature danger zone described in Section 2207. I finished my recitation and fell silent. I had delivered a kill shot wrapped in bureaucratic jargon. I hadn't made a single emotional claim. I had simply listed facts, citing the code sections from memory. The operator was silent for a long moment. "Ma'am," she said finally, her voice now sharp with professional urgency. "Are you an employee or a former employee of this establishment?" "No," I said truthfully. "I am simply a concerned citizen with a lifelong interest in public health and safety." "I see," she said. "Thank you for your report. The specificity of your concerns is noted. We take such detailed allegations very seriously. An inspector will be dispatched to the location immediately." "Thank you," I said. I knew the city would want to protect its citizens. I ended the call. A profound, quiet calm settled over me. I had done my part. I had upheld the standards that had governed my entire life. The rest was out of my hands. I started my car and drove home to the Treme, the familiar streets a comforting balm. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in my favorite armchair, the one Joseph always used to sit in. I didn't turn on the television or the radio. I just sat in the quiet of my home, a home that was now at risk because of my son's ambition, and I waited. An hour later my phone rang. The caller ID was Damian. I let it ring once, twice. On the third ring I answered, my voice perfectly serene. "Hello, Damian." "Mama," he shrieked, his voice a raw, hysterical torrent of disbelief and rage. "What did you do? What in God's name did you do? There's a health inspector here. In the middle of the grand opening. He's shutting us down. The investors are watching. The critic from the Picayune is watching. You've ruined me." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting the storm of his panic break against the seawall of my calm. When he finally paused to take a ragged breath, I spoke. My voice was not the voice of a mother. It was the voice of a proprietor, a colleague, an enforcer of the sacred trust between a restaurant and its patrons. "I simply did my civic duty, son," I said, the word son, a final, ironic twist of the knife. "You wanted to run a high-end restaurant in this city. I just made sure you were being held to the highest standards." "Standards," he sputtered. "You did this to destroy me." "No, Damian," I corrected him, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "You destroyed yourself. You were so focused on the image in the dining room that you forgot about the integrity in the kitchen. An on the door isn't a suggestion, Damian. It's a promise. A sacred promise. You broke it." I did not wait for his reply. I did not want to hear his pleas, his bargains, his empty, desperate apologies. The time for that was over. The woman he was trying to appeal to, the soft-hearted, endlessly forgiving mother, no longer existed. In her place was Augustine Vance, a woman who knew that the most important ingredient in any dish is respect. "I have to go now," I said, my voice soft but final. "Good night." And with that I hung up the phone. The house was silent again. But this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a job well done. The silence of justice. The silence of an old queen, reclaiming her crown. The fallout was immediate, public, and catastrophic. Aura was shut down that night. A bright orange closed by order of the health department sticker slapped on its gleaming glass door before the first dessert had even been plated. The food critic from the Times-Picayune didn't have to write a review of the food. He wrote a scathing front-page column about the hubris and spectacular implosion of the city's most anticipated new restaurant. He detailed the scene with merciless precision. The arrival of the inspector, the panicked whispers, the sight of wealthy investors watching their money evaporate in a flurry of critical violations. The investors, a group of ruthless businessmen from out of town, were not sentimental. They had invested in a Michelin star dream, not a public health disaster. They pulled their funding the next day, suing Damian for breach of contract and misrepresentation. His carefully constructed world, built on my foundation, collapsed in on itself in less than 24 hours. He was left with nothing but debt, humiliation, and the rotting ingredients in his shuttered, contaminated kitchen. I read about it in the newspaper sitting at my kitchen table sipping my morning coffee. I felt no surge of triumph, no glee in his ruin. I felt a quiet, somber sense of order being restored. It was the same feeling I used to get at the end of a long night at my diner, after the last customer had gone home full and happy, and I had scrubbed the kitchen down until it shone. It was the feeling of a job done right. Damian tried to call, of course. Dozens of times. He sent long, rambling text messages, a chaotic mix of rage, self-pity, and desperate apologies. They were the words of a boy who had finally realized the consequences of his actions, but not the reason for them. He was sorry he got caught, not sorry for what he had done. I never answered. I never replied. My silence was not a punishment. It was a boundary. It was the sound of my peace, a peace he was no longer welcome to disturb. The bridge between us, the one I had spent my entire life building, had been burned to the ground not by my anger but by his shame. A week later, a formal, official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from the City of New Orleans Health Department. My heart beat a little faster as I opened it. It wasn't a summons or a legal notice. It was a letter. It was a formal commendation thanking me, an anonymous concerned citizen, for my vigilance in protecting the public health. Your detailed and accurate report, it read, allowed our department to intervene and prevent a potential outbreak of foodborne illness. The city is grateful for citizens like you who uphold our community's standards of safety and excellence. I held the letter in my hands, the heavy paper cool against my skin. This was my validation. This was my Michelin star. It was an acknowledgement of a lifetime of integrity. I took down the last perfect A rating from my old diner, which I had kept for sentimental reasons, and I put this letter in the frame instead. I hung it on the wall in my living room, a testament not to a business that was gone, but to a standard that would endure forever. The bank eventually foreclosed on the loan, but I was able to work out a deal. I sold my little house in the Treme, the house full of memories, and used the proceeds to pay off the debt. I moved into a small, sunny apartment in a quiet building uptown, a place with no mortgage and no ghosts. I was free. My legacy, I realized in the quiet of my new life, was not the ungrateful son I had raised or the failed fancy restaurant he had built on my aching bones. My legacy was in that frame on my wall. It was in the 40 years of perfect peace. It was in the quiet strength I had found in my darkest hour. It was in the profound, unshakable knowledge that quality is not about the price of the ingredients, but about the integrity of the hands that prepare them. It is not negotiable. And sometimes when the world tries to tell you that you belong in the back with the trash, you have to be willing to stand up on your own 2 feet and remind them what a real standard looks like. And that truth, that hard-won, beautiful truth, was worth more than any house. It was everything.